and welcome to this videocast and podcast for subscribers to davidicke.com. Well, I've smiled to myself a few times in the last few weeks as these email leaks come out and confirm much of what people like me and others have been saying all these years about the fact that there's a hidden hand behind world events that is orchestrating things in the shadows that appear very differently in the public arena. And what's come out so far is only one level of it. It goes much, much deeper. But even then, we're seeing how what appears to be one thing in terms of what politicians say and do is actually quite another behind the scenes. And it's amusing in a way to me, having had this whole label thrown at me and others that do what I do, called conspiracy theorists or conspiracy theory by the mainstream media. A tag, by the way, that came into widespread use because the CIA urged American corporate news outlets in the 1960s to use those terms to discredit those who were, quite rightly, questioning the official narrative, the official story of the Kennedy assassination and that of Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, and Bobby Kennedy. And all these decades later, all over the world, I see it all over the world, journalists today, or mainstream journalists, are using the same terms to discredit anybody and label anybody who's doing the job that they should be doing, but don't. And so as these leaks come out, not least about Hillary Clinton, we can see how politics and the system works, even on that level just below the surface. Like I say, it goes phenomenally deeper than that. So we are seeing how the news and the reporting of candidates, like favoured candidates like Hillary Clinton, is orchestrated by what should be an independent, questioning everything, questioning both candidates' media. But of course, it's owned by corporate interests, and the corporate interests want to choose the candidate that suits their interests ongoing more favourably. There's also an agenda for the world, which I've been, goodness knows, exposing for so long, that requires candidates to be put in there as presidents and prime ministers and other positions that are going to either push that agenda forward because they believe in it, or because they don't know what's really going on and are so compartmentalized in their knowledge of the bigger picture that they are pushing things and introducing things without knowing the real big global significance of what they're doing. Either way, this hidden hand operating through corporate interests wants their people in power, and thus will fund them and use their media to support them and help them get into office as much as possible. And that's what we're seeing in the United States now. It's not a question of should it be Clinton or should it be Trump. It shouldn't be either of them. What we should be focusing on is the corrupt, extraordinarily ridiculous nature of a political system in a country of well in excess of 320 million people that throws up these two horrific candidates for people to choose between. That's not choice. People say, oh, you've got to vote for the lesser of two evils. Well, the lesser of two evils is still evil. What kind of political system is that? And so we've seen from these email leaks how the corporate media is working with the Clinton campaign to put her in the best light. And that must be a difficult job to start with. We're seeing in emails that and in private speeches to banks and corporate interests by Hillary Clinton that have been made public now, but it's the last thing she wanted, that she's told them that she has a public and private position on everything. In other words, she lies. She tells the public one thing, but privately believes another and intends to do another if she gets into office. We're hearing this mantra from her, as usual. We must bring Wall Street under control. While privately, she's telling Wall Street the opposite. We have emails and communications confirming that Hillary Clinton, as Secretary of State, knew that Saudi Arabia was funding ISIS. Well, she would have known that anyway. But how come that if there's this fight against ISIS, that a ally of the United States and Britain, Saudi Arabia, is allowed to fund the very group that you're supposed to be fighting, while at the same time you provide Saudi Arabia, both the US and Britain, with the weapons to cause absolute slaughter to civilians in Yemen? And what was Hillary Clinton's response to this knowledge that Saudi Arabia were funding ISIS? It was to take millions of dollars from the Saudi royal family for her deeply, deeply, deeply corrupt Clinton foundation. So we see all of these things. We see the fact that the FBI and the Justice Department were colluding to protect Clinton from prosecution over what she did with classified emails while Secretary of State. But all this is covered up. And yet, we still see this blind support for Clinton, as we see the blind support for Trump on the other side. And we get this extraordinary situation where women, or some women, many women have sussed it, but where many women are saying she's the candidate for us. She's going to be the first woman president. This is someone who cares so much about the rights of women that she takes millions and millions of dollars from the Saudi royal family, whose treatment of women is globally grotesque. And all this, what we're told, this is why elections are so ridiculous. Because all you get in elections is what the politicians think you want to hear, so you'll put them in office. They don't intend to do any of it. The vast majority of them don't anyway, especially the major ones. It's just a perception deception. The whole thing's a perception deception. And now we have this situation where we are heading faster and faster to a point where a conflict between the United States and Russia could break out. That could lead to World War III, which is what has been planned all along. And we see the politicians of the you're in to represent our interests type from the corporate billionaires who are pushing now this agenda of conflict with Russia. They're using terms like we must have a no-fly zone over Syria. And that doesn't mean a no-fly zone. That means no one flies apart from the United States, the UK, and its allies in NATO. And if you introduce a no-fly zone, then conflict can break out any moment that other people, like the Russians or the Assad military, put planes in the air. And we're walking, well, not the people on the inside, they know what they're doing, but vast numbers of people are walking, like sleepwalking, into this, buying the official version of what's going on. And just as that, just not very deep level that we've seen of manipulation with regard to the Clinton emails, etc. If you go deeper, you find that level of the hidden hand that has wanted this Third World War all along and has been manipulating events to bring that about. But because we have politicians who are in on it, the few, and completely ignorant, the vast majority, we're having this ongoing pressure now to bring in this no-fly zone, which, as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff at the Pentagon said recently, would involve war with Syria and Russia. And, of course, then you've got the corporate media who are pushing the same line of it's all the Russians, and systematically suppressing information, which you can get in the alternative media, that children are dying all the time in the Assad-controlled part of Aleppo as a result of missiles being dropped from the terrorists in power in the other side of Aleppo. These missiles are coming across, killing children. The pictures are there to be seen, but you don't see them in the mainstream media because the narrative is it's all the Russians and children are only dying in Aleppo, in those areas being bombarded by Assad and Russian planes. We see anything that happens, like an aid convoy from the UN being hit. So it's immediately, it's the Russians. It's shocking how blatant it is and how few people can actually see it. And we have a situation where left and right are being manipulated in precisely the same way. We now have left and right calling for action against Russia, calling for this no-fly zone. We're having all these progressive organizations like Avaz and the Syrian campaign, the White Helmets, and all these other Western fronts pushing the official narrative as well. We must do something about the Russians. We must have a no-fly zone. And this organization, Avaz, was pressing, one of the organizations pressing for a no-fly zone over Libya. Well, that worked out well, didn't it? Libya is now a basket case with enormous amounts of civilian death and suffering as a result of what happened. But no, let's forget that. Let's forget the fact that it wasn't the Russians that invaded Iraq on a lie. It wasn't the Russians that invaded Libya on a lie, and Syria via proxy terrorist armies that are just fronts for the West. But no, left and right, now it's the Russians. And I'm not saying Vladimir Putin is God's gift to the world. I'm not saying everything that Russia does is perfect. But what's happening here, this demonization of Russia and this playing out that the Western powers that have created such death and mayhem in the world, year after year after year, are somehow the good guys in this John Wayne, good guy, bad guy way of portraying the world. It's a nonsense. And if we don't start to see it and start to call up these politicians for the nonsense they're talking, then we're going to find ourselves in another global conflict purely through ignorance and buying the official story without question. Some of the most uninformed people you come across are people that call themselves progressives, because they get their official story via the progressive newspapers, And the others get their official story by the other kind of newspapers with a different political line. But it's the same basic narrative. And so we have a situation where humanity has given its power away to such an extent that we have allowed psychopaths, liars, and complete idiots to take over the systems of government and military and finance and produce the world that we are living in, that we see on the television news every day. What are we doing? You know, it's no good people saying, it's the politicians, it's the this, it's the that. Okay, so what are you doing? Oh, I don't know, it's a good program on the telly tonight. Exactly. And when you give your power away because you can't be bothered, oh, I don't think about politics. Well, don't complain then. And when you have people who will only get their information from the mainstream and not look elsewhere to see if the official stories stand up, don't complain when you're scammed. And you know, I saw a guy this week. His name's General Mark Milley. He's the chief of staff of the U.S. Army. And if anyone wants confirmation of how humanity has given its power away to complete idiots, then they should watch this clip. This is the head of the U.S. Army talking like a playground bully, like a 10-year-old. And if a 10-year-old said it, you say to him, hey, act your age, don't be so silly. But this is the mentality that we have given power to and given power to them that could trigger World War III. What are we doing? Have a look at this.
I want to be clear to those who try to oppose the United States. I want to be clear to those who wish to do us harm. I want to be clear to those around the world who want to destroy our way of life and that of our allies and friends. The United States military, despite all our challenges, despite our op-tempo, despite everything we've been doing, will stop you and we will beat you harder than you've ever been beaten before. Make no mistake about that.
That man, with that attitude and that John Wayne, we're the good guys, we're the big guys, we'll beat you. That barely one-dimensional, childlike view of the world, it is an example of the kind of idiots that are running the military worldwide and running politics worldwide. Because this hidden hand is looking for two types of people to represent its interests and push on its agenda. One, those that are aware of what they're doing and now are in full support of it. They are the few, as I said earlier. And then the others who are basically not very bright, here today, gone tomorrow people, never knowing the bigger picture, and operating in a tiny postage stamp of perception of everything. Well, you know, Millie, I rest my case. And this week in Britain, we had a former Conservative Party minister called Andrew Mitchell calling the Russian, or relating and likening the Russian happenings in Syria as like the Nazis and like the fascists of Italy. And again, calling for a no-fly zone, which, as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the United States has said, will mean war with Syria and with Russia. And Andrew Mitchell is someone who's been elected. People have actually elected this man to Parliament to represent their interests. And he wants action against Russia that will clearly lead to an all-out conflict if that takes place. And while he's calling Russia and relating them to Nazis and Italian fascists, all is forgotten about the grotesque, unspeakable mass killing and maiming of millions of civilians by this Mr. and Mrs. Evil of global geopolitics, Britain, America, and other NATO countries. And like I say, it's not just the right, it's the so-called progressives, the so-called left, that are also supporting this ludicrous, blatantly made up and contrived narrative in terms of we must stop the Russians. We must stop the Russians. Well, how come it was only when Russia came in that ISIS and these terrorist groups were pushed back across Syria? It wasn't being done before, even though the Americans were bombing, the British were bombing, others were bombing, and nothing was happening. The terrorists and ISIS were moving closer and closer to Damascus. Why? Because they weren't trying to stop them. This ISIS al-Nusra terrorist group under different names, actually controlled by the same force, is being used as a proxy army to remove Assad. And the Russians come in and do something about it, and suddenly they are guilty of war crimes. Well, if they're guilty of war crimes, then what the heck are the West guilty of in Iraq, in Libya, in Syria, and elsewhere? And then we got this lady. She's an opposition Labour Party MP called Anne Clwyd. And she says in a parliamentary debate this week, where is the rage? Where are the demonstrations that we've seen on so many previous occasions? I challenge people listening to this debate, 2 million, 3 million, 4 million people outside the Russian embassy day after day. What about the US embassy? How about the UK Foreign Office, which together contrived to bring about, as I've shown in detail elsewhere, contrived to bring about this fake uprising in Syria as simply a front to justify the removal of Assad? Why not protest outside those centres of mass murder and Clwyd? And why not mention them? And Anne Clwyd was a staunch advocate of the invasion of Iraq in 2003. A Rupert Murdoch newspaper praised her for swinging public opinion behind support for the war, and Tony Blair made her special envoy on human rights in Iraq. If it wasn't so tragic, it'd be hilarious. And she was such a vehement supporter of the invasion of Iraq that despite the absolute catastrophe, the human catastrophe, the catastrophe in terms of what's gone on as a result of that invasion in Iraq, she still says today that if she had the chance to vote again, she would vote for the invasion. It's extraordinary. Ladies and gentlemen, these are the people, left and right, who we have given our power to run this world. And that's why we have the world we do. And Boris Johnson, the Foreign Secretary, also called in that debate for a demonstration in London against Russia at the Russian embassy. And he could say that without a hint of shame when the UK and Britain are the world's biggest destroyers of human rights and peace in other countries. And, you know, I look at these people who call themselves progressives. I mean, the biggest problem I see with progressives is they're not progressive. They're just another arm of the state, while thinking that they are actually challenging the state. And progressives are always talking about racism. But what about the racism of Western countries continually, one after the other, bombing and destroying countries that are home to people overwhelmingly with brown faces? What about that racism, that imposition of the Western will upon these countries so that you cannot have the leaders that we say you can't have? You must have who we say you must have. It's extraordinarily obvious racist imperialism, which the British Empire and now the American Empire has been using for centuries and imposing on the world. And it's all these progressives. Oh, look, it's me heart's on me sleeve. I'm a progressive. I'm ever so good, I am. And they talk about racism all the time, but then ignore the extraordinary racism that's going on year after year in the Middle East. And, we have a situation where it's got so laughable that the US State Department's spokesman, a guy called John Kirby, can be asked about the mass killing of civilians and children in Yemen by a Saudi Arabia armed by the United States and Britain. And he can say that's not the same as what's happening in Syria with Russia. The narrative that everyone is pushing and left and right are just following like sheep is that we demonize Russia because we want to go to war with them and we want to justify going to war with them. But we also want Saudi Arabia to be bombing Yemen. So therefore, it's not the same, because one narrative suits us and the other narrative of it's not the same suits us. In fact, they're both grotesque. What is happening and what has happened all these years in Syria, what is happening now in Yemen, are both equally grotesque. And that's what people with balance, people who really cared about justice and freedom and peace, would be saying. But they're not. The people in power are not saying that. They're not seeing that both those things are the same. Because one suits them and one doesn't. Why? Because there is a hidden hand with a hidden agenda pushing what suits it all the time. And that's why there's so many, apparently so many contradictions in what these people say about different situations. But there's no contradiction in their mind, because they'll support what suits the agenda and they'll oppose what doesn't suit the agenda. It's that simple. And if people can't see it now, well, there's no hope for them, really, because it's never been so blatant what's going on. And the fact that these countries in the Middle East, like Iraq, Libya, Syria, were on a list before 9/11. 9/11 was the trigger to start picking that list off. And it's still going on. But we're asked to believe it's all random and it's all happening by random choice and by accident. It's not. The human race has given its power away to psychopaths, liars, and idiots. And unless we decide to take it back and stop being programmed in our perceptions by those people, then they will lead this world to utter global catastrophe. I wonder what's on the telly tonight.